The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered brick facade of Lincoln Community College as Warren Buffett stepped out of his modest sedan. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few dozen cars scattered across the cracked asphalt. No limousines, no security detail, no fanfare. Just an 83-year-old billionaire in a slightly wrinkled suit, carrying a simple manila folder, walking toward what most would consider an unremarkable graduation ceremony. But Warren Buffett had learned long ago that the most remarkable moments often came disguised as ordinary ones. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, handwritten on letterhead so simple it might have been from a local diner. "Mr. Buffett," it read, "we would be honored if you could attend our spring graduation ceremony. We know it's not Harvard or Stanford, but for our 37 graduates it means everything. Sincerely, Dr. Margaret Chen, President, Lincoln Community College." What the letter didn't mention, what Dr. Chen couldn't have known, was that Warren Buffett had been waiting 47 years for this moment. Inside the small auditorium, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. Parents clutched cameras, grandmothers dabbed at their eyes, and siblings squirmed in their Sunday best. The graduates, resplendent in borrowed caps and gowns, sat in the front rows with expressions mixing pride, nervousness, and the peculiar vulnerability that comes with crossing life's thresholds. Warren took a seat in the back, declining the reserved chair in the front row. He preferred to observe, to listen, to understand the rhythms of other people's lives before inserting himself into them. It was a habit that had served him well in business and, more importantly, in the quieter transactions of human connection. Dr. Chen approached the podium, a woman in her 50s whose steel-grey hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She had the bearing of someone who had spent decades fighting for institutions that others overlooked, for students that others had given up on. When she spoke, her voice carried both warmth and authority. "Welcome, families and friends, to Lincoln Community College's 42nd graduation ceremony. Today, we celebrate not just academic achievement, but transformation. Every person on this stage has overcome obstacles that might have stopped others. They've juggled jobs and childcare, financial hardship and self-doubt. They've proven that education isn't about where you start. It's about the courage to keep moving forward." As she spoke, Warren's eyes moved across the graduates. There was Maria Santos, 43, whose nurse's aid certification would finally allow her to support her 3 children without working 2 jobs. James Mitchell, 28, a former factory worker whose engineering degree represented 5 years of night classes and weekend study sessions. And in the third row, her dark hair barely contained beneath her cap, sat Sarah Chen. Warren's breath caught almost imperceptibly. The resemblance was unmistakable. The determined set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, the quiet intensity in her dark eyes. She was Dr. Chen's daughter, though Warren was perhaps the only person in that auditorium who understood the full weight of that connection. His mind drifted backward to a humid September evening in 1976. The phone had rung. At 11:47 p.m. in Warren's Omaha home, Rose Buffett answered, her voice thick with sleep, then quickly sharpened with concern. "Warren, it's for you. Something about Columbia." Warren had taken the call in his study, still wearing the reading glasses that made him look older than his 46 years. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate. "Mr. Buffett, this is David Chen. You probably don't remember me. I was in your security analysis class at Columbia in '68. I'm calling from San Francisco." Warren remembered him immediately. David Chen had been one of his most promising students, brilliant with numbers but hampered by an almost painful shyness. While other students competed to ask the most impressive questions, David would linger after class, approaching Warren's desk with carefully prepared inquiries that revealed a mind both analytical and deeply curious. "Of course I remember you. David, what's wrong?" The story came out in fragments. David had used his Columbia MBA to land a position at a small investment firm in San Francisco. He'd married his college sweetheart Margaret, and they'd just welcomed their first child, a daughter named Sarah. Life had been building towards something good, something stable. Then the bottom fell out. The investment firm had been built on a foundation of lies. Client money had been diverted, regulations ignored, and when the authorities finally intervened, David found himself unemployed, his reputation tainted by association, his savings depleted by legal fees for a crime he hadn't committed. "I've sent out over 200 resumes." David's voice cracked through the long-distance connection. "Nobody will even grant me an interview. Margaret's been working at a diner, but with the baby, Mr. Buffett, I don't know what else to do. I've always tried to do things the right way, but the right way isn't working." Warren had listened to the entire story without interruption, his pen moving across a yellow legal pad, not taking notes, but drawing the interconnected circles and lines that helped him think through complex problems. When David finished, Warren was quiet for a long moment. "David, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. If you could start over, what would you want to do?" "I'd want to teach," David answered without hesitation. "I'd want to work with students who are like I was, smart but uncertain, full of potential but lacking opportunity. I'd want to show them that the principles we learned in your class aren't just about making money. They're about making better decisions, building better lives." Warren had smiled in his darkened study. "Can you be in Omaha on Thursday?" 3 days later, David Chen sat across from Warren in a downtown Omaha restaurant, looking nervous and slightly bewildered. Warren had spent the morning making phone calls, calling in favors, and arranging introductions. By lunchtime, he had assembled a network of contacts at 3 different universities, 2 community colleges, and a community investment cooperative that was looking for someone to teach financial literacy to low-income families. "I can't guarantee you'll get rich doing this work," Warren had said, cutting into his steak with characteristic efficiency. "But I can guarantee you'll go to bed each night knowing you've made someone's life a little better. And in my experience, that's worth more than most people realize." David had taken the job with the Community Investment Cooperative. Within 2 years, he'd parlayed that position into a teaching role at a small college. Within 5 years, he was running financial education programs across 3 states. And within 10 years, he had met and married a woman who shared his passion for education, a woman who would later become Dr. Margaret Chen, president of a small community college that specialized in giving second chances to people who'd never had first ones. Warren had followed David's career from a distance, the way he tracked all his investments, not just the financial ones, but the human ones. He'd attended David's second wedding, quietly funding a scholarship program at David's college, and when David had died suddenly of a heart attack 12 years ago, Warren had anonymously paid for Sarah Chen's entire undergraduate education. Sarah had never known. Margaret had never known the money came from Warren. They believed it came from a foundation established in David's memory, which was technically true. Warren had simply never mentioned that he was the foundation's sole contributor. Back in the small auditorium, Dr. Chen was introducing the keynote speaker, Warren himself. He made his way to the podium with the unhurried gait of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. "When Dr. Chen invited me to speak today," Warren began, his voice carrying easily through the small space, "she mentioned that this wasn't Harvard or Stanford. She was wrong about that. Harvard and Stanford graduate students who've had every advantage, every opportunity, every door opened for them. That's admirable, but it's not courageous." He paused, his eyes finding Sarah in the 3rd row. "Courage is Maria Santos, working double shifts to support her children while completing her nursing certification. Courage is James Mitchell, studying calculus at kitchen tables after 12-hour factory shifts. Courage is believing in yourself when the world suggests you shouldn't. Warren spoke for 20 minutes about the difference between price and value, about the compound interest of small daily improvements, about the importance of investing in yourself even when, especially when, others won't invest in you. But beneath the familiar themes, those who knew how to listen could hear something else, a love letter to persistence, to second chances, to the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. When he finished, the applause was warm, but brief. These weren't people accustomed to lengthy ovations. They had places to be, jobs to return to, children to collect from babysitters. As families gathered for photographs and congratulations, Warren approached Dr. Chen. "Margaret," he said quietly, "could I speak with you privately?" She led him to a small office behind the auditorium. The walls were covered with photographs of graduates, scholarship recipients, and community partnerships. On her desk sat a framed picture of a young man Warren recognized immediately, even across decades. "You know," Warren said, "I had a student once who believed that education wasn't about creating advantage. It was about creating opportunity. He used to say that the best teachers weren't the ones who made learning easy, but the ones who made it meaningful." Dr. Chen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You knew David." "I knew him well. He was one of the finest students I ever taught, and from what I can see, one of the finest men I ever knew." For a moment, the composed college president's facade cracked. He would have been so proud of Sarah today. She's wanted to be a teacher since she was 12. She's starting her master's program in the fall, education policy. She wants to work with underserved communities, help create programs like this one. Warren nodded slowly. "And how is she paying for graduate school?" "She's been saving for 3 years, working 2 jobs. She'll have enough for the first semester, maybe the second. After that," Margaret shrugged, with the practiced resignation of someone who had learned to make impossible budgets stretch. Warren removed the manila folder he'd been carrying and placed it on her desk. "47 years ago, your husband called me in the middle of the night. He was facing an impossible situation, and he needed help. I was able to provide some guidance, make some introductions. It was a small thing for me, but it changed the trajectory of his life." He opened the folder to reveal a single document. "This is a trust I established in David's memory. It's been accumulating value for 12 years. The trustees, that would be me, have decided it's time to make a distribution." Margaret looked at the papers and her hands began to tremble. The trust was worth $347,000. "This is too much," she whispered. "We can't accept this." "You're not accepting anything," Warren replied gently. "This money has been Sarah's for years. She just didn't know it yet. Consider it compound interest on an investment her father made when he chose to dedicate his life to education instead of enrichment." Margaret Chen, who had spent decades managing budgets and negotiations, who had stared down hostile school boards and unsympathetic legislators, who had built an institution from determination and willpower, sat down heavily and began to cry. "There's one condition," Warren continued. "Sarah must never know this came from me. As far as she's concerned, it's from a foundation her father inspired, which is absolutely true." Warren left Margaret in her office and walked back toward the auditorium, where the celebration was beginning to wind down. He found Sarah Chen near the stage, still in her cap and gown, talking animatedly with an elderly couple he assumed were grandparents. He waited until she was alone, then approached. "Congratulations, Sarah. Your mother tells me you're planning to pursue graduate studies in education policy." Sarah's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her calling. "Yes, sir. I want to work with community colleges, help them develop programs for non-traditional students. Places like this, they're not just schools. They're lifelines, but they're always underfunded, always fighting for resources. And why is that work important to you? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. My father died when I was 15. He was a teacher, and even though we never had much money, he used to tell me that education was the one investment nobody could take away from you. He said that every person deserves a chance to become who they're meant to be, regardless of where they start. Warren smiled. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. I wish he could have seen this day. I think, Warren said carefully, he would have been very proud. As Warren walked back to his car, the late afternoon sun casting everything in golden light, he reflected on the peculiar mathematics of human connection. David Chen had been one student among hundreds, one phone call among thousands, one small intervention in a career filled with larger, more visible successes. Yet here was his daughter, carrying forward his values, multiplying his impact in ways that no stock portfolio could measure. The drive back to Omaha gave Warren time to think about legacy, a subject that occupied more of his thoughts these days. Most people thought of legacy in terms of monuments, buildings with your name on them, foundations that outlast you, achievements that historians will remember. But Warren had come to believe that the most important legacies were the ones that couldn't be measured, the quiet influences that rippled outward through lives and generations. David Chen would never appear in any biography of Warren Buffett. Their connection was too small, too personal, too distant from the grand narratives of investment success and philanthropic gestures. But in 47 years, one midnight phone call had become a career in education, which had become a community, in college presidency, which had become a daughter inspired to serve others, which would become programs and policies, and thousands of students whose lives would be changed in ways both measurable and mysterious. 6 months later, Warren received a letter written on familiar letterhead. Dear Mr. Buffett, it began, I wanted to update you on some exciting developments at Lincoln Community College. Thanks to a generous donation from the David Chen Memorial Foundation, we've been able to expand our evening programs and provide additional support for single parents pursuing their education. We've also hired a new program coordinator, my daughter Sarah, who just completed her master's degree in education policy. She's passionate about creating pathways for underserved students, and her first initiative is a financial literacy program that teaches practical investment principles to working families. She calls it compound interest for real life, and she insists that ordinary people can make extraordinary progress if they understand a few simple principles about patience, consistency, and long-term thinking. I think her father would approve. I know you would too. With gratitude, Margaret Chen. Warren read the letter twice, then filed it in a folder marked Personal Investments. It was a thin folder, much smaller than the ones containing his financial holdings, but in many ways more valuable. That evening, as he sat in his study reviewing quarterly reports and market analyses, Warren found himself thinking not about percentage returns or market capitalization, but about Sarah Chen, probably working late in her small office at Lincoln Community College, developing programs that would help other people's children find their way to better lives. He thought about the phone call 47 years ago, about David Chen's desperate voice across a crackling long-distance connection, about the choice to help when help was needed, without thought of recognition or return. He thought about the slow accumulation of small kindnesses, about investments that paid dividends in human flourishing rather than financial gain. Outside his window, Omaha settled into its evening rhythms. Lights came on in houses where families gathered around dinner tables, where children did homework with parents who had never gone to college themselves, where dreams were nurtured by people who understood that the most important lessons weren't about money. They were about the quiet, Courage required to keep believing in better things. Warren Buffett, who had spent his life understanding the mathematics of compound interest, smiled as he contemplated a different kind of calculation altogether. Some investments, he had learned, couldn't be measured in dollars or percentages. They could only be measured in lives changed, opportunities created, and hope sustained across generations. The truest returns, he realized, were the ones you never expected to see. In the weeks that followed, Warren found himself thinking often about that graduation ceremony. Not because it was unusual. He had attended dozens of similar events over the years, but because it had reminded him of something he sometimes forgot in the complexity of managing billions of dollars and global investments. The most important transactions were often the simplest ones. A month after the ceremony, Warren was reviewing his philanthropic commitments when his assistant knocked on his office door. "Mr. Buffett, there's a young woman here to see you, Sarah Chen. She says you met her at her graduation." Warren looked up from his papers, genuinely surprised. "Send her in." Sarah entered his office with the slightly nervous confidence of someone who had spent considerable time working up the courage for this moment. She was no longer wearing a cap and gown, but rather a simple business suit that suggested both professionalism and practicality. "Mr. Buffett, thank you for seeing me. I know you're incredibly busy. Not too busy for this. Please sit down. How can I help you?" Sarah took a breath, clearly having rehearsed this moment. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at graduation, about the difference between price and value. And I've been wondering if you might be interested in a particular kind of investment opportunity." Warren leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "I'm listening." "Lincoln Community College serves about 800 students, but we turn away twice that many every year because we don't have the resources to accommodate them. Most of these students are working adults, single parents, people who've been laid off and need retraining. They're not looking for prestige, they're looking for skills that will help them build stable lives. Stable lives." She reached into a folder and withdrew a carefully prepared presentation. "I've been researching similar institutions across the Midwest. With relatively modest investments in infrastructure and programming, we could create a network of community colleges that specialize in practical education for working adults. Not just individual schools, but a coordinated system that shares resources, develops standardized curricula, and creates pathways for students to move between programs and locations." Warren studied the material she'd prepared. The financial projections were conservative but realistic. The social impact analysis was thorough. The implementation timeline was ambitious but achievable. "This is impressive work, Sarah. But I have to ask, why bring this to me? There are foundations, government programs, other sources of funding for educational initiatives." Sarah met his eyes directly. "Because I think you understand something that other funders don't. This isn't charity. This is investment. Every person who gets skills training instead of remaining unemployed generates tax revenue. Every parent who can support their family reduces the need for social services. Every person who learns financial literacy makes better decisions that ripple through their community." She pulled out another set of documents. "I've calculated the economic returns. Based on data from similar programs, every dollar invested in this kind of education generates approximately $4 in economic activity over 10 years. But, more importantly, it creates something you can't quantify: hope." Warren was quiet for several minutes, reviewing her work. Finally, he looked up. "You know, your presentation reminds me of something. 47 years ago, I had a conversation with a young man who wanted to dedicate his life to education instead of pursuing more lucrative opportunities. At the time, I thought I was just giving him some career advice. It turns out I was making one of the best investments of my life." Sarah looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I understand." "That young man was your father, Sarah. David Chen was one of my students at Columbia. When he ran into trouble early in his career, he called me for guidance. I was able to help him find his way into education, and that choice led to a life of service that touched thousands of students, including a daughter who would grow up to believe that education could change the world. Sarah's expression shifted as she processed what Warren was telling her. "You knew my father. I knew him well, and I've been following his family's work from a distance ever since. The trust that paid for your graduate education, that came from me in his memory. Your mother never knew I wanted it that way." For a moment, Sarah sat in stunned silence. Then quietly she began to laugh. "So when I walked in here with my presentation, thinking I was approaching a stranger, you were approaching someone who's been invested in your family's mission for nearly half a century," Warren finished. "The question now is whether you're prepared for the kind of commitment this work really requires." Over the next hour, Warren and Sarah discussed the details of what would become the David Chen Educational Foundation, not a traditional foundation that simply awarded grants, but an active investment partnership that would acquire and develop community colleges across the Midwest, creating a network of institutions focused on practical education for working adults. Warren would provide the initial capital, $50 million to start, with additional funding as the network expanded. Sarah would lead the organization, working with educators, community leaders, and students to develop programs that met real needs in each location. "There's one condition," Warren said, as they prepared to conclude their meeting. "This can't be about me. I don't want my name on buildings or programs. This is about your father's vision, your mother's work, and your commitment to continuing their legacy." Sarah nodded. "I understand, but I have a condition too." Warren raised an eyebrow. "I want you to teach a class at each of our schools, not about investing, but about decision-making, about how to evaluate opportunities, how to think long-term, how to distinguish between what's urgent and what's important. The practical wisdom that makes everything else possible." Warren smiled. "I think I can arrange that." As Sarah left his office that afternoon, Warren reflected on the strange circularity of life. A phone call in the middle of the night had led to a graduation ceremony, which had led to this conversation, which would lead to thousands of additional phone calls, graduation ceremonies, and conversations he would never know about. This was compound interest of a different kind, not the mathematical progression of money earning money, but the human progression of lives touching lives, of one person's commitment inspiring another's, of small acts of faith accumulating into movements that changed communities. 2 years later, the David Chen Educational Foundation operated 6 community colleges across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. Warren taught his decision-making seminar twice a month, traveling to different campuses and working with students who reminded him why he had gone into teaching in the first place, decades before he had become known for anything else. The students in these classes were different from those he had taught at Columbia or Stanford. They were older, more experienced, often more skeptical. They had been disappointed by promises before. They had learned to be wary of anything that sounded too good to be true, but they were also hungry for practical wisdom, for tools that would help them navigate financial decisions, career choices, and life transitions. Warren found that teaching them required him to distill his thinking to its essence, to focus not on complex strategies, but on fundamental principles. "The most important investment you can make," he would tell each new class, "is in yourself, not because it's guaranteed to make you rich, but because it's the only investment that no one can take away from you." He would tell them about the power of compound interest, not just in financial terms, but in human terms. Every skill you learn, every book you read, every person you help, it all compounds. But you have to be patient. You have to trust the process, and you have to keep showing up, even when you can't see the results yet. Sometimes after these classes, students would approach him with questions that had nothing to do with finance or business. A single mother wondered if she should risk leaving a stable but low-paying job to pursue nursing certification. A laid-off factory worker asked whether it was too late to start over at 53. A young veteran struggled with choosing between immediate income and long-term education. Warren listened to each question with the same careful attention he brought to analyzing investment opportunities. Not because these individuals represented significant financial opportunities, but because he had learned that the most important questions were often the most personal ones. One evening, after teaching at the Lincoln Community College campus, Warren was approached by a student named Miguel Rodriguez. Miguel was 41, a construction worker whose chronic back injury had forced him to consider a career change. He was enrolled in the Foundation's project management program, but he seemed troubled by something beyond academics. "Professor Buffett," Miguel said, using the title Warren preferred in these settings, "can I ask you something that's not about class?" "Of course." "My daughter Sophia, she's 17, a senior in high school. She's smart, really smart. Her counselors think she could get into some good colleges, maybe even get scholarships. But she's talking about skipping college, getting a job right away to help with family expenses." Miguel's voice carried the weight of a parent who wanted to give his child opportunities he'd never had. "I know education is important. That's why I'm here, trying to learn new skills. But I also know that our family needs income now. How do you decide between what you need today and what might help tomorrow?" Warren was quiet for a moment, thinking not just about Miguel's question, but about the echo of similar questions he'd heard throughout his life. David Chen, calling in desperation 47 years ago. Sarah Chen, choosing between immediate work and graduate school. Thousands of students and parents, all trying to balance present needs with future possibilities. "Miguel, let me ask you something. If Sophia takes a job right out of high school, what kind of work would she likely find? Retail, maybe food service. Not bad work, but probably not more than $12 or $13 an hour. And if she goes to college, gets a degree in something practical, education, nursing, business, what might she earn? More, I know that. Maybe twice as much, maybe more. So we're not just talking about 4 years of college costs. We're talking about 40 years of earning potential. The question isn't whether your family can afford for Sophia to go to college. The question is whether your family can afford for her not to go." Warren paused, then continued. "But I understand the immediate pressure. Here's what I'd suggest. Sophia applies for every scholarship she can find. She looks into community colleges that offer transfer programs, 2 years at a lower cost, then transfer to a 4-year school. She works part-time during school and full-time during summers. It's not easy, but it's doable. And if the money still isn't enough, Warren smiled. "Then you let me know. The foundation doesn't just operate schools, Miguel. We also provide scholarships for students whose parents are enrolled in our programs. Sophia's exactly the kind of student we want to support." 3 months later, Warren received a graduation invitation written in careful handwriting on drugstore stationery. Miguel Rodriguez was completing his project management certification and wanted to invite Warren to the ceremony. At the bottom of the invitation, in different handwriting, was a note. "Mr. Buffett, this is Sophia. I got accepted to UNL with a partial scholarship. The foundation covered the rest. I'm going to study elementary education. Thank you for helping. My dad, and thank you for helping me. I hope someday I can help someone else the same way." Warren attended Miguel's graduation, a much smaller affair than the ceremony where he'd first met the Chen family. Afterward, he congratulated Miguel and met Sophia, a poised young woman with her father's determined eyes and her own quiet confidence. "What made you choose elementary education?" Warren asked her. "I want to work with kids who are like I was, smart but maybe not sure they belong in school, kids whose parents are working hard but don't have college degrees themselves. I want to show them that learning can be fun, that they can achieve things they don't even know they want yet." Warren nodded approvingly. "Your father mentioned you're planning to start at UNL in the fall." "Yes, sir. I'm nervous but excited. I know it'll be challenging, but I think I'm ready. I think you are too. And I think your father's example has prepared you for challenges better than most people your age." As Warren drove home that evening, he found himself thinking about cycles and patterns, about the way individual choices accumulated into family legacies, community changes, and societal shifts. Miguel Rodriguez had chosen to retrain for a new career instead of accepting unemployment. Sofia Rodriguez had chosen college instead of immediate employment. In both cases, they had chosen the longer, more difficult path because they believed in compound interest, not just financial, but human. These were small stories, invisible to most of the world. But Warren had learned that the most important stories usually were. The dramatic narratives that made headlines were often less significant than the quiet decisions that people made in private moments, when they chose between what was easy and what was right, between what was immediate and what was lasting. The David Chen Educational Foundation continued to expand. By its 5th year, it operated 12 campuses and had graduated over 3,000 students. The economic impact studies showed exactly what Sarah had predicted. Every dollar invested generated multiple dollars in economic activity, reduced dependence on social services, and increased tax revenue. But the statistics that mattered most to Warren couldn't be quantified. They were the stories that arrived in his office irregularly, unpredictably, like dividends from investments he'd forgotten he'd made. A letter from a grandmother who had earned her GED at age 67 and was now tutoring other adult learners. A photo from a single father who had used his welding certification to start his own business and was now hiring other graduates from the program. A wedding invitation from a former student who had met her husband in their shared accounting class and wanted Warren to know that their first dance would be to a song that reminded them of the patience and persistence he'd taught them about. Building something valuable over time. These communications arrived without fanfare, tucked between financial reports and meeting requests. Warren's assistant would place them on his desk with his other correspondence, not realizing that he often read them before turning to anything else. One afternoon, nearly 6 years after that initial graduation ceremony, Warren received a call from Dr. Margaret Chen. "Warren, I have some news I wanted to share with you personally. Sarah's been offered a position with the Department of Education in Washington. They want her to head up a new initiative on community college innovation, essentially taking what we've built here and scaling it nationally." Warren leaned back in his chair. "That's wonderful news, Margaret. She's earned it. She's conflicted about accepting. She loves the hands-on work we're doing here, the direct contact with students and communities. She's worried that Washington will be too removed from the actual impact." "What do you think she should do?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I think she should do what her father would have done, follow the opportunity to help the most people, even if it means sacrificing some personal satisfaction." "And what does Sarah think her father would have done?" "She thinks he would have asked you for advice," Warren smiled. "Tell Sarah to come see me." The following week, Sarah Chen sat in Warren's office, looking much as she had during their first meeting, but carrying herself with the confidence that comes from years of successful leadership. "The Washington position would give me the opportunity to influence policy affecting millions of students," she began without preamble. "But I'd be trading direct impact for systemic influence. I'd be writing memos instead of teaching classes." "And that concerns you?" My father always said that education was personal, that you couldn't help people from a distance through policies and procedures. You had to be present, available, willing to adjust your approach based on what each individual needed. Warren nodded. Your father was right about that, but he was also practical. He understood that sometimes you have to work within systems, to change them. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the Omaha skyline. Sarah, let me tell you about a decision I made 50 years ago. I had the opportunity to stay in New York, work for a large investment firm, be part of the financial establishment. Instead, I came back to Omaha, started my own company, worked with individual investors who trusted me with their savings. He turned back to face her. For years, people told me I was limiting myself, that real influence required being at the center of power. But I discovered something interesting. By staying close to the work that mattered to me, by maintaining direct relationships with the people I served, I was able to build something that eventually gave me more influence than I would have had by climbing someone else's ladder. Sarah considered this. You're saying I should stay with the foundation? I'm saying you should trust your instincts about what kind of work brings out your best abilities. The foundation will benefit from having someone in Washington who understands community colleges from the inside, but the foundation will also need you to remain connected to the work that inspired you in the first place. Warren returned to his desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing a single sheet of paper. I've been thinking about succession planning for the foundation. Not because I'm planning to step back immediately, but because good institutions outlast their founders. I'd like you to consider a different proposition. He handed her the document. Accept the Washington position, but maintain your role as president of the foundation. Spend 3 days a week in Washington, 2 days traveling to our campuses. Use your government position to advocate for policies that support community colleges. And use your foundation work to demonstrate what's possible when those policies are implemented effectively. Sarah studied the proposal. This would mean more travel, more complexity, managing dual responsibilities. It would also mean maximum impact, and it would honor your father's belief that education is both personal and systemic, both local and national. Sarah looked up from the document. Why are you willing to make this work for me? Warren was quiet for a long moment. Because 47 years ago, your father called me in the middle of the night and trusted me with his desperation. That phone call led to everything we've built together. Now you're at a crossroads, and I want to make sure you have the same kind of support that I was able to provide him. 6 months later, Sarah Chen was confirmed as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community College Innovation at the Department of Education. She maintained her office in Lincoln, traveling to Washington 3 days a week and spending the remainder of her time visiting community colleges across the country. The national program she developed, based on the David Chen Educational Foundation model, became the template for federal community college policy. Within 3 years, similar networks were operating in 12 states, serving over 40,000 students annually. But the measurement Warren cared about most wasn't the scale of the program or the number of students served. It was the continuation of something more fundamental, the belief that education could transform lives, that individuals deserved investment even when their potential wasn't immediately obvious, and that the most important returns were often the ones that took generations to fully realize. On a warm spring evening, exactly 10 years after that first graduation ceremony, Warren Buffett found himself once again in the parking lot of Lincoln Community College. This time, however, the lot was nearly full. Cars stretched into the overflow area, and a small crowd had gathered near the main entrance. The occasion was the 10th anniversary celebration of the David Chen Educational Foundation, and Sarah had insisted that Warren attend as the guest of honor. He had reluctantly agreed. though he remained uncomfortable with public recognition. For work, he considered a private matter between friends. As he walked toward the building, Warren was approached by a young man in his early 20s, wearing a navy suit that looked recently purchased. "Mr. Buffett, I'm James Rodriguez. Sophia Rodriguez is my cousin. You helped her get to college about 6 years ago." Warren paused, studying the young man's face. "James, how is Sophia doing?" "She's doing great, sir. She graduated from UNL last month with her education degree. She's starting as a 5th grade teacher this fall in the same elementary school we both attended. She wanted me to tell you that she's already implementing some of the decision-making principles you taught in your seminars." James shifted nervously, clearly building towards something important. "Mr. Buffett, I was wondering if I could ask you about something. I just finished my associate's degree in business through the Foundations program. I've been accepted to transfer to UNL, but I've also been offered a management position at the company where I've been working part-time." Warren recognized the familiar pattern. Another young person standing at the intersection of immediate gratification and long-term investment. "Tell me about both options." The management job would mean good money right away. Maybe 40,000 a year to start. I could help my family, maybe save up to buy a house, but the bachelor's degree, that would mean 2 more years of school, more debt, and no guarantee of anything better afterward. "What does your gut tell you?" James was quiet for a moment. "My gut tells me I'm not done learning yet, but my wallet tells me I should take the money." Warren smiled. "Your gut is usually smarter than your wallet, especially when you're 22. But let me ask you this. What kind of work would you want to do if money weren't a factor?" "I'd want to help other people start businesses. Small businesses, family businesses. I grew up watching my Uncle Miguel struggle with the paperwork and regulations and financial planning when he started his construction company. There are a lot of people in our community who have good ideas and strong work ethics, but they don't know how to navigate the business side of things. And you think a bachelor's degree would prepare you for that kind of work?" "I think it would give me credibility. People might trust a consultant with a 4-year degree more than someone with just an associate's degree, even if I have the same knowledge." Warren nodded approvingly. "Credibility is valuable, but knowledge is more valuable. Here's what I'd suggest. Take the management job, but use it as a laboratory. Learn everything you can about how businesses actually operate. Cash flow, customer service, personnel management, regulatory compliance. Meanwhile, take evening classes toward your bachelor's degree. It'll take longer, but you'll graduate with both theoretical knowledge and practical experience." James looked thoughtful. "That's harder than either option by itself. The best opportunities usually are, but think about it this way. 5 years from now, you'll either be a manager with a college degree and real-world experience, or you'll be wondering what might have happened if you'd been willing to work a little harder for something better." After James left, Warren continued toward the building, reflecting on how many similar conversations he'd had over the past decade. Each individual story was unique, but the underlying themes were consistent. Young people trying to balance immediate needs with long-term aspirations, families making sacrifices for future generations, communities investing in their own renewal. Inside the auditorium, Warren was surprised by the size of the crowd. The small space that had once held 37 graduates and their families now contained nearly 300 people. Foundation graduates, current students, faculty, community leaders, and families filled every seat. Dr. Margaret Chen approached the podium, looking remarkably similar to how she had 10 years earlier, though Warren noticed new lines around her, eyes that spoke of additional years spent fighting for resources and advocating for students. 10 years ago, she began, Warren Buffett attended our spring graduation ceremony. 37 students received their degrees that day, and most of us assumed it was just another graduation. notable only because we had attracted such a distinguished speaker. She paused, looking directly at Warren. What we didn't know was that Mr. Buffett had been part of our story for much longer than any of us realized. We didn't know that his investment in one struggling student 47 years ago had created ripples that would eventually reach all of us. Margaret went on to describe the foundation's growth, the thousands of students who had been served, the communities that had been strengthened. But Warren found his attention drifting to the individual faces in the crowd, wondering about their stories, their struggles, their quiet victories. When Margaret introduced him, Warren approached the podium with the same unhurried pace he'd used a decade earlier. But this time, looking out at the assembled crowd, he felt something different. Not pride, exactly, but a kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing an investment mature in ways he had never anticipated. When I spoke here 10 years ago, Warren began, I talked about the difference between price and value. Tonight, I want to talk about the difference between return and impact. He gestured toward the crowd. If you measure return in traditional terms, dollars invested versus dollars received, the David Chen Educational Foundation looks like a terrible investment. We've spent millions of dollars and haven't received a penny back. A few people in the audience chuckled, unsure whether he was serious. But if you measure impact, lives changed, families strengthened, communities renewed, this has been one of the most successful investments I've ever made. Not because of the scale of what we've accomplished, but because of the nature of what we've accomplished. Warren paused, his eyes finding familiar faces throughout the crowd. Miguel Rodriguez, now running his own construction company and employing 6 other foundation graduates. Maria Santos, who had used her nursing certification to become a supervisor at the regional hospital and was now studying for her bachelor's degree in healthcare administration. James Mitchell, the former factory worker, who had parlayed his engineering degree into a position designing manufacturing systems for renewable energy companies. The students who graduate from our programs don't just get jobs, Warren continued, they get tools for making better decisions, for building stronger families, for creating opportunities where none existed before, and they use those tools not just for themselves, but for their children, their neighbors, their communities. He looked toward the back of the auditorium where Sarah Chen stood with a small group of current students. Sarah Chen once told me that her father believed education was the one investment nobody could take away from you. He was right about that. But I think he would also say that the best education is the kind that multiplies, the kind that makes you better able to help others become who they're meant to be. Warren spoke for another 10 minutes about compound interest in human terms, about the patient capital required for social change, about the courage required to invest in people whose potential might not be immediately obvious. When he finished, the applause was sustained and heartfelt. Afterward, as people lingered for conversations and photographs, Warren found himself approached by a steady stream of graduates, current students, and family members. Each had a story to share, a connection to make, a thank you to express. One conversation particularly moved him. An elderly woman named Dorothy Williams approached with her granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 16. Mr. Buffett, Dorothy said, I wanted you to meet my granddaughter, Keisha. She's a junior in high school, and she's been asking me about college. Keisha stepped forward, clearly nervous, but determined. My grandmother told me you help people figure out how to pay for school. I want to study computer science, but nobody in my family has ever gone to college. I don't even know where to start. Warren knelt slightly to meet Keisha at eye level. What made you interested in computer science? I like solving puzzles, and I like the idea that you can create things that help people. My grandmother has diabetes, and she has trouble keeping track of her medications and appointments. I've been thinking about how to design an app that would make it easier for people like her. Warren smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes for good computer scientists. You're not just interested in the technology, you're interested in how it can solve real problems. He stood and looked at Dorothy. Has Keisha talked to her school counselors about college preparation? Some, but they mostly talk about the big universities. Those seem so expensive, so far away from what we know, Warren nodded. Keisha, let me suggest something. Start with community college courses while you're still in high school. Get familiar with college-level work, build relationships with instructors, prove to yourself that you can succeed. Then you can transfer to a 4-year program with confidence and with some credits already completed. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card. More importantly, talk to Sarah Chen about our scholarship programs. We specifically support students who are the first in their families to attend college. You're exactly the kind of student we want to help. As Dorothy and Keisha walked away, Warren overheard Keisha saying to her grandmother, "He talked to me like I was already a college student, like it was just a matter of figuring out the details." That's because he sees what you can become, not just what you are right now, Dorothy replied. The conversation reminded Warren of something he had learned over decades of investing. The most valuable opportunities were often the ones that others overlooked or undervalued. Companies trading below their intrinsic worth, but also people whose potential exceeded their circumstances. Communities whose assets weren't reflected in conventional measures. As the evening wound down, Warren found himself in conversation with Sarah Chen and several Foundation board members. They were discussing expansion plans, policy initiatives, and funding strategies. Important conversations, but Warren found his mind wandering to individual stories. Keisha Williams designing apps to help her grandmother, James Rodriguez learning to balance management and education, Sophia Rodriguez preparing to teach children, who reminded her of herself. "Warren," Sarah said, drawing his attention back to the group discussion. "We were talking about legacy planning for the Foundation. How do we ensure that this work continues long after all of us are gone?" Warren considered the question carefully. "The same way your father ensured his legacy, by investing in people who share the values that matter to you, by creating systems that can adapt and evolve while maintaining their core purpose, and by remembering that the most important legacy isn't what you build, it's what you inspire others to build." He looked around the nearly empty auditorium, where custodial staff were beginning to stack chairs and clean up after the celebration. This building, these programs, even the Foundation itself, none of that is the real legacy. The real legacy is Dorothy Williams believing her granddaughter can become a computer scientist. It's Miguel Rodriguez employing other people who need second chances. It's Sophia Rodriguez teaching 5th graders that they can achieve things they haven't even dreamed of yet. Sarah nodded slowly. "So the legacy is the ripples, not the stone." Exactly, and the beautiful thing about ripples is that once they start, they create their own momentum. They don't need you to sustain them. As Warren drove home that night, he reflected on the mathematics of influence. 47 years ago, he had helped one struggling student find his way into education. That investment had compounded over nearly 5 decades, growing into a family dedicated to service, a foundation serving thousands of students, and a national model for community college innovation. But more than that, it had created a culture of investment in human potential. Every graduate of their programs carried forward the belief that education could transform lives, that individuals deserved support even when their potential wasn't immediately obvious, that communities grew stronger when they invested in their most overlooked members. Warren had always understood compound interest in financial terms, the way money grew when returns were reinvested rather than consumed. But he had come to believe that human compound interest was even more powerful. Every person who was helped became capable of helping others. Every life that was transformed increased the likelihood that other lives would be transformed. Every investment in education created dividends that paid out across generations. The drive back to Omaha gave him time to think about his own legacy, a topic that had occupied more of his thoughts as he entered his 80s. Most people would remember him for his investment success, his business acumen, his philanthropic commitments. But Warren suspected that the most important parts of his legacy might be the ones that could never be measured. The late-night phone calls answered, the quiet investments made, the belief sustained in people who needed someone to believe in them. 3 weeks after the anniversary celebration, Warren received a package with no return address. Inside was a hand-bound book titled Stories from Lincoln Community College 10 Years of Transformation. The cover featured a photo from that first graduation ceremony with Warren visible in the back row. The book contained dozens of stories written by foundation graduates, students, and faculty. Some Warren recognized from his conversations over the years, others were completely new to him. Each story was unique, but they shared common themes: second chances seized, obstacles overcome, potential realized despite circumstances. One story particularly caught his attention. It was written by a student named Patricia Morrison, whom Warren didn't remember meeting. I enrolled in the Lincoln Community College nursing program at age 49, 3 years after my husband died and left me with no job skills and significant debt. I'd been a stay-at-home mother for 25 years, and I felt like I had nothing to offer the working world. The financial aid counselor told me about a scholarship program, and I almost didn't apply because I was sure they would want to help someone younger, someone with more potential. But the application asked about my goals, not just my grades, and I wrote about wanting to take care of other people, the way the nurses had taken care of my husband during his illness. I got the scholarship, graduated with my RN, and now work in the oncology unit at the Regional Medical Center. Last month, I was assigned to care for a man whose wife was struggling with the same feelings I had experienced, the sense of being useless, of having nothing to contribute. I spent extra time with her, not just providing medical updates, but listening to her fears about what would happen after her husband was gone. I told her about my own experience, about the possibility of starting over even when you think it's too late. She's now enrolled in our medical coding program. Mr. Buffett probably doesn't remember meeting me at last year's graduation ceremony, but I remember what he said about compound interest in human terms. I'm beginning to understand what he meant. Warren set the book aside and walked to his window, looking out at the Omaha skyline as afternoon shadows lengthened across the city. Somewhere in that landscape were thousands of people whose lives had been touched directly or indirectly by investments made decades earlier. Students and teachers, parents and children, employers and employees, all connected by invisible threads of influence and opportunity. He thought about David Chen, the nervous graduate student who had called him in desperation 47 years ago. David had been dead for over a decade now, but his influence continued to grow through his daughter's work, his wife's leadership, and the thousands of students who had been shaped by institutions he had helped to build. This was the kind of legacy that mattered most to Warren, not the kind that required monuments or endowments, but the kind that lived in the daily choices of people who had been given chances they might not have otherwise received. As evening settled over Omaha, Warren returned to his desk to review the day's financial reports. Markets had been volatile. Several of his holdings had declined in value, and analysts were predicting continued uncertainty in the months ahead. But Warren found himself thinking not about quarterly returns or market fluctuations, but about Patricia Morrison caring for cancer patients, about Sophia Rodriguez preparing lesson plans for fifth graders, about Keisha Williams learning to code solutions for problems she saw in her own community. These investments couldn't be tracked on any portfolio. summary or quarterly report. They generated no measurable returns, required no management fees, and created no taxable events. But Warren had come to believe they were the most valuable investments he had ever made, because in the end, he had learned the question wasn't how much money you could accumulate or how many deals you could complete. The question was how many lives you could touch, how much potential you could unlock, and how much hope you could sustain in people who needed someone to believe in them. Warren Buffett, who had spent his life mastering the mathematics of compound interest, smiled as he contemplated the incalculable returns that came from investing in the one asset that never depreciated: human potential. The truest wealth he had discovered was measured not in dollars, but in lives transformed, not in percentage returns, but in ripples that would continue long after he was gone, spreading outward through communities and generations in ways he would never fully see or understand. And perhaps that was exactly as it should be. If this story reminded you that the smallest stages can hold the greatest moments, like this video and subscribe to Panorama Legacy. Every click helps us share stories that speak softly, but leave echoes that last. Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And how did this graduation moment make you feel? And if you're ready for another story, one that honors the quiet gestures that shape lives forever, click on the next video on your screen, because sometimes what changes everything isn't a speech, but what someone does after the applause fades.